Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us at the 2021 Asia Liberty Forum. Although our event is coming to a close, I hope you're leaving us feeling inspired and well prepared for the path forward and to run toward achieving your goals. After participating in the events these past 2 days, I see so many reasons to hope for a more prosperous future in Asia. Thank you for all that you do for promoting human dignity and freedom around the world and for participating in our program and learning from one another. I also want to pause to give yet another thank you to the sponsors of our Regional Liberty Forums. Those include John Templeton Foundation, Smith Family Foundation, the Templeton Religion Trust, Freda Utley Foundation, Thomas W. Smith Foundation, and the Sarah Skate Foundation. Thank you so much for making these important exchanges and engagements possible. Now, before we move into the final discussion of the day, I have an exciting announcement: the awaited winner of the 2021 Asia Think Tank Shark Tank competition. Earlier today, we saw our contestants, Satya Karunaratne from Advocata Institute in Sri Lanka, Noor Zulaika Azmi from Ideas in Malaysia, and Andri Suryanta from the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies in Indonesia. They made their pitches to the judges, and the judges have decided on a winner. So without further ado, the winner of the 2021 Asia Think Tank Shark Tank competition is, of the Advocata Institute in Sri Lanka, Satya Karunaratne. Let's take a moment to view some highlights of the winning pitch.
Through the communication component of this project plays a very important role, because many of the women who are impacted by these gender discriminatory land inheritance laws do not even know their rights. So what we intend to do is, firstly, through these communication efforts, we intend on educating these women on why property rights are important, the kind of protections provided to them by the law, and also we wish to advocate for the reformation of these laws by engaging with policymakers and policy implementers. That, in gist, is how we wish to utilize this $10,000 prize in order to reform these gender discriminatory laws, land inheritance laws here in Sri Lanka.
Congratulations to you, Satya, and to each of our contestants. I cannot wait to see what you'll achieve with the prize funding. And although I'm on the other side of the world, I'll be cheering you and the whole Advocata team on all along the way. We're ending the event talking today about a topic that is very important to me. Women, as 51% of the global population, work hard to improve the lives of millions, maybe billions, every day, bearing, in most parts of the world, a disproportionate amount of family care and household chores, while also increasingly taking on more and more responsibility for household earnings. Joining me in this next hour are three individuals passionate about bringing more independence and economic freedom to women in their home countries, and about the role civil society can play in that transformation. With that, I am honored to welcome, first, Charu Chadha, a journalist at the Media 9 outlet in Nepal. Welcome, Charu.
Thank you so much.
Next, we have Trisha Yo, CEO of the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs in Malaysia. Welcome, Trisha. We're happy to have you.
Thanks for having me.
And finally, our third panelist is Bhuvana Anand, director of the Trias Foundation in India. So let's get down to it. What are we talking about today? So it seems obvious to me that freedom advocates like those in our network of Atlas partners would be the natural and even primary champions of equal rights for women around the world. After all, throughout history, in almost every country, governments have ensured that the simple fact of being a woman meant that life is harder. So, why is it that phrases like women's rights are human rights are coined, promoted, owned by the left, while classical liberals rarely, and often even reluctantly, wade into the topic? There are undoubtedly many reasons. My own theory is that one of them is that there's a deep reluctance to engage in anything that looks like identity politics, anything that treats people as groups rather than individuals. The fact is, though, that women are already being treated as a group by the government, and in far too many cases, that means vastly unequal opportunity and even subjugation. They have been restricted both legally and culturally from making the independent choices that allow them to set their own life's course. In many nations around the globe, that remains the case. So perhaps then, it's time we get over our fears of being labeled as participating in identity politics and instead just get to work. There is so much work to do after all. According to the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World report, as of 2015, there were only 48 countries in the world in which women were legally afforded the same rights as men. And what does that mean? And what can civil society organization like yours do about it? That's what our panel is here to share with us today. So let's get started. I'll start with Charu. So talk to me about what that means a little bit, Charu. What does it look like in Nepal, for example? What does it mean? What does that look like to not have the same rights, for women not having the same rights as men in Nepal?
Thanks, Casey. Basically, if you're a woman in Nepal, it really, again, depends on the geography of where you are. Nepal is vastly divided into urban and the rural areas. The realities of being a woman in the rural or the remote parts of the country is very different to being in the urban areas of Nepal. But yet the differences are very, very, it stares you in the eye, literally. Right from, your right to education, your right to inheritance, your right to travel. I mean, in the most recent case that I can give you an example of, a bill was proposed in February 2020 that women under the age of 20 require a consent from their families to travel overseas. So, these things are very, very real challenges. And I can give you an example of when I was a teenager. I was just starting out in my career in journalism, and around that time, Daniel Pearl, the American journalist, had been killed in Karachi. The Maoist insurgency was full on in Nepal, and one of our journalists died, but it never made it to the news, to the world news. So I think the global news, the global media also is very selective in its approach of how countries are portrayed and how issues are picked up. So yeah, I mean, let me start there, and then maybe we can go back to this discussion. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Charu. I'm glad you brought up the issue of sort of permission. We were talking in preparation for this panel, and Bhuvana mentioned her experience in India and just women's experience in India when it comes to similar issues. Bhuvana, do you have something to add to what Charu said just about kind of the different treatment under the law that women face in India?
Thanks, Casey. Such a pleasure to be here. Yes, and this is, in fact, just before this conversation began, Trisha and I were talking that the World Bank released the Women, Business and Law report. And a few things from that report are really striking. One, more global, and then I'll come to India as well. Globally, women on average have about 3/4 of the legal standing that men have, right? That should make us sit up and worry. Because this is not peculiar to our countries. This is, in fact, a progression that has been successfully traversed in the West, but that we are navigating currently in countries in Asia or in Africa, etc. To take the example of India, today, there are a plethora of different ways in which the legal standing afforded to women is subpar compared to men. So several examples. The first is just a woman's right to choose work, right? So whether it is working in the night shift, 26 out of 28 states in India, and remember, a state in India is equal to a mid-sized country in the world, right?
Right.
Which means you're talking about a massive population impact or footprint. 26 out of 28 such states do not allow women to work at night. In addition, there are about 56 individual factory processes that a woman is not allowed to participate in, right? That means that you fundamentally said that a woman can't rise the rank from the bottom to the top. She can never play supervisory sort of roles on a shop floor, right? Women can't be construction forepersons in India. They can't, there are several, sort of employment-related restrictions. Inheritance-wise, there are some changes afoot at the moment, but for the bulk of our life as a republic, women have not had equal rights to property, the way, particularly inheritance property, the way men do. Similarly, there are a whole host of sort of police acts that step in that sort of dictate in so many ways women's participation, or leave them at the mercy of either a local beat cop or at the mercy of sort of a more advanced bureaucrat, right? In all of these kind of strange ways, it tends to trample on sort of being at par and to be able to claim that position, which I think both of which are important. It's not just the notional right, but also what comes from that right. I do want to talk in a little bit about other ways in which there is such sort of economic discrimination, but perhaps we can come back to that.
Thank you, Bhuvana. Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up the labor restrictions. I know that one of our Templeton Freedom Award finalists in 2020 was based in Kerala, India, and was working on reducing restrictions to women working at night and different things around labor in Kerala. Like you said, I think 35 million people live in Kerala, that state alone, so it's good to get that context of the population size in India. Let's move over to Trisha here. So I know that you have some commentary just about kind of challenges that women tend to face in the workplace in Malaysia. So can you talk to me a little bit about that, sort of building off of what Bhuvana said about labor restrictions? What are the challenges look like in Malaysia?
Thanks, Casey. So I think the conversation around anything economic in Malaysia is complicated by our demographics. In order to understand the challenges that women face, I think we first need to look at the different ethnic groups in Malaysia, because while there is a divide of urban and rural, as Charu pointed out earlier, we have another fault line in our society, which is the ethnicity fault line. So the majority race in Malaysia is the Malays. And unfortunately, because of some traditional cultural values that are still very inherent among the Malays, who are slightly more conservative compared to perhaps the non-Malays. So I myself am ethnically Chinese, and we also have a small minority of the Indians. But because of the majority race being Malays, I would say that the cultural norms and also the religious conservatism that arises among the Malay population, the Malay women are the ones that seem to be subject to greater discrimination. And I'll talk maybe about 2 or 3 examples about why that is. So a very interesting statistic is that if you look at the statistics of women in the workforce, in Malaysia, women actually do represent quite a high percentage of women working. However, when you look at the age range, once they get married and they have children, a majority of them actually don't come back to work. So this means that you're only capturing a very small percentage of women. Maybe they're single, they are unmarried. Once you're in your 30s and you're childbearing, you don't come back. And the rate of returning women to the workforce is even lower than countries like Vietnam or Indonesia. And I think really this has got to do with the lack of a support system, expensive childcare. And so that's one, more general professional factor that I think both the public and the private sectors don't take into consideration so seriously. But another second very, very important factor, which I think perhaps liberals don't take into account so much. And I myself fall into that trap. I think you mentioned, Casey, earlier that we tend not to want to be associated with identity politics. But I think more and more, as I myself go through different phases of becoming a mother myself, I do see that there is merit to be given to look at group dynamics. And this second factor is religion. So Malaysia is a Muslim nation, or rather Islam is the official religion here. And that means that the majority of the ethnicities I told you about, Malay Muslims, are subject to these laws. There's very unequal inheritance property laws that women are actually put at a direct disadvantage over. And I'll mention one specific thing, which is about marriage and divorce laws. So in Malaysia, under the Muslim law, the Islamic law, a man can unilaterally divorce the woman. And because of the natural predisposition to inheritance laws favoring the men, the women are always scrambling as to how much they're going to get. The sort of Faraid is like the inheritance law, is also unfavorable to daughters compared to sons, which means that if the daughters are already growing up in a household where the inheritance is going to be lower, so the starting point for a woman, a young woman actually, would already be disproportionate and unequal. You're starting on unequal ground. I have a third factor, which is the employment factor, but I think I'm talking a lot now, but I'll just mention that it's because of the way in which our economy is structured in Malaysia. It also happens to be that the private sector is dominated by the non-Malays. So the Chinese tend to be active and they can climb quickly in the private sector. And this leaves the public sector dominated by Malays. And because the public sector, which means the state-owned enterprises, your government-linked companies, and we do a lot of work on that, happens to be occupied by people who are, again, naturally predisposed to male chauvinism and very domineering. And that environment is just not enough. It's not good for women to flourish in that environment. So I'll just stop with those three factors for now.
Thanks so much, Trisha. There's so much to unpack there. I want to build on it in so many ways with our other panelists. Let's start with Charu. So Trisha talks about sort of women leaving the workforce and the flexibility that women need as a result of sort of their disproportionate care burden. And I know that, Charu, you have talked about sort of the failure of female entrepreneurs to scale, right? Women do engage in entrepreneurship, often informally, but what does being informal mean? So what does that look like in Nepal? If you're kind of forced to be in the informal sector, what does that mean for your ability to grow your business if you're a woman in Nepal?
So the informal sector is pretty much like 80 to 90% of businesses enterprises being conducted as it is. And women, there's about 90% of women workforce, people engaged in work, are part of the informal economy in Nepal, which kind of puts them at a very big disadvantage, simply because a lot of women choose to go. Why they choose to go into business is basically because it's more to do. It's not for their own personal growth. It's normally got to do with adding to the family income, dealing with poverty, being a single parent. Your choices are so limited, so you kind of get into some form of enterprise. And access to finance is a big question mark here, because being a part of the informal economy, you can't really apply for proper bank loans and things like that. So you tend to mortgage your gold, your property, borrow from neighbors, families, things like that. And the reason then women get kind of constrained is because they become minimal risk takers. They can't afford to take too many risks in the entire process. And so scaling is like out of the question. Plus our, we do have a growing segment of venture capital and foreign direct investment, people who are interested, friends of Nepal who want to invest into people, especially women groups or women cooperatives or women single entrepreneurs. They are not able to do that because the laws are not favorable. So for an FDI investment, you need probably $500,000, and women are probably just thinking in terms of $1,000 or maximum $10,000 in terms of starting their business. So these are certain areas where being part of, for example, with the COVID-19 also occurring, it's been a big thing because a lot of people have just gone out of work overnight. They don't know where to turn to. They don't have any form of protection. They don't, there's it's like a blanket situation, literally.
Right. Thank you so much, Charu. You mentioned the pandemic, and I think that's a really important point for us to kind of touch on here, especially in India, where, like Nepal, there's so many people working in the formal sector, and we saw major crisis during the pandemic. Bhuvana, can you talk a little bit about what that's been like uniquely for women trying to navigate those waters without that kind of support?
I mean, it's been a hard situation all around, right? But particularly where poverty is such a looming sort of feature of everyday life, all of these things get compounded severely. So there are a few different things that I'd like to touch on, particularly as far as the pandemic and the after effects go. The first is, of course, the sheer loss of income. Exactly the way it is in Nepal, we have, sort of women disproportionately work in the informal sector or run home-based businesses, which means that all of, sort of the opportunities to be able to scale or to earn from that have been shut down, particularly because our countries also imposed drastic lockdowns, right? Which meant that you couldn't be selling your wares on the street. You couldn't, there was a, sort of enormous amount of clamp down. So that's effect number one, is the income basket itself reduces. And particularly in the case of women's income, it's largely supplementary income for for households. The second part of it is what happens downstream in the household, because the woman's sort of slush funds have now gone away, right? There are huge impacts on health and nutrition, particularly for children. And this is non-trivial stuff, because all of the, top-up nutrition that would come in the household typically comes out of the woman's sort of discretionary spending fund, which is inevitably stuff that she earns herself, right? So that's the second big challenge that I see, at least in Indian households, or typically in poorer Indian households. The third is sort of, and this may be peculiar to India, but I suspect not, is the mass migration that has, sort of featured in the last decade, 2 decades, right, to urban centers. And during the pandemic, sort of the reverse migration back. Now, what does this mean in terms of several different things? The life that you had built, the life that you could have built, the life that you now have to rebuild, right? And in all of the conversations, you don't realize what is going on insofar as families go, or insofar as the soft social aspects of it go, right? And this is not often talked about, in my view. And the last is, I mean, that which doesn't necessarily, I think, affect women in the informal sector, but women like you and me, who are sort of more in formal employment and part of the sort of more services-oriented workforce, right? It means that our lives are now spent before Zoom and having all of these conversations. But, inevitably there is childcare burden at home. There is the household and kitchen duties, all of which are disproportionately borne by women. So now they've got this, and in some ways, getting out of the house was great for women, right? Because it meant some scaling down of those restrictions, if you will. And all of that has gone away now. And a lot of the times I know we tend to celebrate this kind of remote working. I'm not that confident that it's so great for women, that there are things that we have to think about or take into consideration, which may not be that beautiful, as it were.
Right. Women are kind of back in the home needing to balance everything. The kids were home from school during the pandemic, and now suddenly you're trying to work a full-time job and take care of the kids in the house. A point that Charu and Bhuvana both touch on is sort of how being informal has all of these implications down the line when it comes to growing, when it comes to security, when it comes to, not having to pay bribes to the police. And I know the Center for Civil Society in India, where Bhuvana used to work, worked for a long time on eliminating a minimum capital requirement, which relates very closely to what Charu mentioned about having to have a minimum amount in the bank before you can have a formal business, and what that means for people. So Trisha, I don't know if you have any additional commentary on that, or just specifically, from your perspective in Malaysia, which is sort of a differently organized economy than Nepal and India, sort of what the pandemic has done for policy and for women in the workforce.
Yeah, thanks. I think definitely Malaysia is structured more differently. In the 80s and 90s, we went through this rapid industrialization process. So we have more, I would imagine, more decentralized industrial cities in different parts of at least the peninsular Malaysia. So we also have East Malaysia, which has a very different set of economic factors there. But I wanted to, I guess, touch on a few points following up on what both Charu and Bhuvana have talked about, and also what you said, Casey. So Malaysia doesn't have as stringent regulations when it comes to, say, like opening bank accounts. We had a conversation, I think, previously where in India, women actually have to, or are asked as to whether they are single or married. And I find that, completely appalling. I was very surprised when I heard that. So we don't have that in Malaysia. However, since you talked about the Economic Freedom of the World report and the index, it does take into account a rather obscure, again, Islamic-related law. So it's a Sharia law that requires women to seek their husband's permission to start a business. And as a result, our score in that particular category is affected. However, it's actually hardly ever practiced in reality. So that's one of those things, like the difference between the regulation and the practice, like how it's implemented. But I think the fact that many of these laws do exist is very worrying. And earlier on, Bhuvana had also mentioned this Women, Business and the Law report. And this index also scores Malaysia actually very badly. So I actually took the liberty of comparing Malaysia, Nepal, and India. And Malaysia scores 50, India scores 74.4, and Nepal 80.6. And in the region in Southeast Asia, actually, Malaysia is very, very low. I mean, we score even lower than Brunei. And I don't think that's really setting a gold standard, as I was telling my colleagues earlier. So I think that there are some legal and regulatory challenges that do lie ahead for the majority of women in Malaysia. And then just following on the pandemic as well, I think it's probably safe to say that women across the board, whether it's Malaysia, India, Nepal, or elsewhere, were affected by the lockdowns, and they continue to be. In Malaysia, the government has done a series of very confusing and inconsistent regulations as to what is considered essential versus non-essential. And they've been doing this for over a year and still can't really get it right because things are connected, right? So we know that the economy is intricately connected, the supply chains are there. And so what they've done now is that they've said for this particular lockdown, nurseries are only open for children whose parents work in essential sectors. And this is really tough for women. I think the research already shows that women lost their jobs 5 times as many as compared to men over the last year. And while the economy has slightly recovered in 2021 compared to 2020, the jobs for men have recovered, but the women's jobs have not. So it means that women actually did take a hit. They just couldn't go back to work. Perhaps they were wage earners. They couldn't get back into the working environment. But more broadly, the informal sector, I think by definition, it means that it's very, very difficult to capture the data within the informal sector. Malaysian women have been involved in the informal sector for years and years. I mean, that's how we started out as a trading nation. And so sometimes it is a little bit ironic that the statistics may not capture that when in fact they do. They go out into the street, they do vending, they do a lot more than perhaps the economy is actually formally capturing. So I do think there's a role to formalize that part of the economy and to give them a greater boost. And I think one thing we haven't touched on yet, which I think is relevant for all of us, is how the pandemic actually accelerated some trends in a positive way, where women could actually get on the whole digitalization bandwagon. And with the skills that they have at home, they could do that to complement their existing income.
Yeah, Trisha, I'm glad you brought up childcare because that's something that I wanted to touch on with the group, which is there are lots of ways, non-obvious ways, that regulation that seems at first to be gender neutral disproportionately impacts women's ability to participate in the workforce. So I know that at the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies, they're currently working on research about how childcare regulations that end up limiting the number of childcare providers because it's so expensive to become a childcare provider drives up the cost of childcare in Indonesia and means that lower income families can't afford childcare, which then means what? Women can't take their kids to childcare and they can't go, build a career. So, Bhuvana, I know that you have some notes on this from India, and I'd just love to kind of hear, what are some of the non-obvious ways? I was talking to a friend recently about this, and she sort of joked that she recently wrote a poem about how much she loves her dishwasher. And it just got me thinking about how, non-obvious things like that, like having reliable electricity or being able to afford a dishwasher because there aren't a bunch of trade restrictions, can really change women's lives. So, Bhuvana, why don't you start us off with commentary on that area?
Sure. I largely will speak to, of course, the Indian example. There are so many sort of interesting absurdities as that, it's like tragicomedy playing out, right? On the one hand, you'll have all of these kind of absurd rules that essentially penalize on the basis of sex, right? So, for example, in the case of food safety regulations, and Trisha brought up the digitalization. So, imagine the lockdown and so many sort of food delivery businesses now starting. Except that now these food safety regulations have clearly never stepped into an Indian kitchen, right? And they've got mandates such as, the stove should be about 3 feet away from the wall. You've got to be about 12 feet off the ground. I mean, this is absurd because no low middle class, average Indian kitchen, and particularly, sort of women-run, only semi-commercial kitchen would ever be able to meet this. I'll tell you a story, right? And in fact, Charu is prodding us to tell more interesting stories. My aunt, who's been a role model in my life, left an abusive, violent marriage about 40 years ago. And with no money, no education, and only sort of the real skill that she had was she was a superb traditional cook. Right? And she was able to make homemade snacks and pickles, which is a big deal in India. And, and not a giant business, just to be able to sell to friends and extended family and so on and so forth, right? For 20 years, it was fine. But as India decided that it needed to get more sophisticated on some of these counts, it turned around and said, well, you can't really say homemade on packaging of foods, right? And the only way you can say it is if you meet X, Y, Z criteria and the bureaucrat says it's homemade. And so today, this woman who does make homemade snacks and pickles, does a superb job of it, couldn't run and make a business out of it, right? And the other kinds of non-obvious ways is a lot of the times, at least in India, the focus tends to be on more giving, right? We're going to have a law that says maternity benefits of 6 months or childcare in the premises of the company for such and such time and so on and so forth. Some of it may have merit and there's certainly worth thinking about, but there are a lot more basic things to do, right? So just simple things, how you spend public exchequer money. So, for example, how you spend on electricity, metering electricity, or on cooking gas. And India did do some beautiful things, which simply said, listen, let's convert this cooking gas business into direct benefits transfer, right? And that allows you to be able to spend wisely, and it allows the household, and particularly women in the household, to make adaptive decisions that are right for the household. Similarly, other things, bringing in market-based pricing for water and electricity, right? Means hours that women spend at community taps. You save them that kind of both the boredom of waiting in those lines at sheer time cost, but in addition, the backbreaking work of picking up giant buckets of water and ferrying them back and forth to the home, right? So that's, other things. The last of these is sort of trade. And we don't tend to think about trade and its gender impact as much. But at least in the case of India, which is one of the worst offenders on the Trade Barrier Index, that our friends actually have come up with. India and China, those are the two worst offenders. And in India, you have, I was just this morning looking at the budget statements of the last few years. And every year, you have a long list of about 150 things that have, customs duties on them or quotas that are imposed on them. Everything ranging from olive oil to pulses, to materials that, washing machine imports and other kinds of time-saving devices in the house, or for that matter, life-saving drugs, including vaccines, which in the case of India have 10-20% tariff premium, right? And who bears the cost of this? It's not just a gender diffused household cost. It is in particular time cost and emotional cost that women bear compared to sort of men. These are all things that I think should be no-brainers for us, but it turns out not so much.
Thank you, Bhuvana. I'm glad you mentioned sort of, things that are being given to women in the name of sort of honoring women and helping them, like 6 months mandatory maternity leave and things like that. So that kind of brings me to my next question, which is kind of what is the broader feminist movement, women's equality movement getting wrong in your communities? I know, maybe that looks like quotas. What are the negative impacts of some of that broader policy agenda? So, Chowdhury, why don't we start with you in Nepal? Kind of what do you see in Nepal in terms of what that movement is sort of getting wrong?
I think in terms of the feminist movement across, creating a gender-neutral kind of a situation, especially in our work, in our homes and things like that, I think eliminating men from the conversation is a big one for me personally. Not having men come in and understand these conversations, participate in these conversations, and be a part of the entire dialogue is what I see as a major barrier. Number one. Number two, I think it's always been a little competitive in the sense like, okay, now women need this too, it's all, why do women need my mother never needed this, for example, so why do you need it? That kind of a situation is always there. So I think it starts from our access to education to begin with, and then it starts from our right to information. It's also about having our laws made easier to understand for women, because in our country, at least, I think for India and Nepal, it would be true that it's limited literacy. And women, and even the most educated of women also somehow get caught into different things, and they're not able to kind of, understand their rights too well. So that, and then also the civil society, having active, right now with the social media structures, it's amazing, how hugely the civil society responds, and you have citizen networks, you have these signature campaigns happening against certain things. So that kind of accelerates response to certain laws and policies. But otherwise, I think it definitely needs to start with having more conversations that have both men and women included in them.
Thanks, Chowdhury. Let's move to Trisha here. I know that you have some comments just on this topic, and then more broadly about women who sort of step outside the norms and sort of blaze a path despite some of these barriers. And so I just want to hear from you on that.
Yeah, I wanted to respond quickly to what you said, Casey, earlier, because, you talked about devices, right? I think the washing machine alone revolutionized women's rights all the world over. I mean, including in America, right?
Absolutely.
When it came out.
Yes.
Yeah. The fact that, there's a machine that can do the washing for me. So I think that actually took away a lot of, it contributed to the civil rights movement in ways that I think the inventors never thought it would. So I want to say that actually, for us at Ideas, I just made that quick calculation, like 6 out of our 7, I would say, like management, the top management are actually women. And I think in Malaysia, we are sort of spoiled by, we have these artificial understandings because there was one point in our past where our governor of our central bank was a woman, the head of our Securities Commission was a woman, our Minister of International Trade and Industry was a woman, and it was all at the same time. So I think sometimes we've become cushioned into the belief that there are no barriers for women, so there are all kinds of women leaders all over the country, and we see that in even the C-suites and so on. But I think that's also I think one thing we need to get right in this in the liberal movement is to recognize that there are differences between the elite educated women versus the non-elite rural non-educated, and they tend to be much more conservative in their worldviews in the first place. So that's one thing to remember to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is I think it's dangerous for us in this movement to shun the conservative perspective entirely, because the danger of that, so whether or not it's men, so it could also be women, by the way. In Malaysia, there was this hilarious, I mean, I say hilarious, but it's actually quite sad and quite concerning. There was a group of women who set themselves up in response to the liberal movement. So they called themselves the Loyal Wives Club, something like that. And because they actually said that, no, it's the husband's right to do what they want with us in the marriage. And even if they, demand for things in bed, like we should give it to them. And people like us who are in the liberal movement and civil society, we were completely disgusted at that. But at the same time, it tells you that we do live in a dichotomous society. Like we have to recognize that the parallels of this dichotomous world between conservatives and liberals. And I know those labels mean different things in different countries. So I'm using this in a social context, right? So not in the economic context. I think recognizing that is the first step, and then making sure that we don't shun the conservative view, because so when I say conservative, I again mean social conservatism, not economic, because once you shun that, then I think it can very quickly descend into not taking into consideration anything that liberals actually believe in, because the language that is used is different, the perspectives that we use would be different, and I think understanding the language and the tone of which, for example, in Malaysia, the religious conservatives would believe to be true. For example, they would want to maintain things like polygamy laws or laws that are unequal for women's inheritance, as I mentioned earlier. So that's already the natural tendency. So we need to be able to find language and a kind of narrative that can approach people like that in a way to bring them on board with us, as opposed to shun them completely. I just want to mention something about regulation, which Bhuvana was talking so wonderfully about earlier. So something about price setting, as an example, in Malaysia. So yeah, I think our Ministry of Domestic Trade, I remember a couple of us went over to the ministry once, and they were giving a presentation about why it's important to set prices. And they actually put this picture of a cabbage, of different sizes of cabbages on the PowerPoint screen. And oh no, this size of a cabbage, this large, has to be this price. And then if you go down to this size, there's measurements and weights as well, it should be this price. So that's ridiculous, right? Because obviously, if you can imagine women in the marketplace, they're going to set the price according to supply and demand. So that's definitely something to remove as a barrier.
Thank you, Trisha. Charu, I know at the beginning you sort of touched on how geography can impact your life's course, and it seems like that ties into Trisha's point here about sort of the difference between rural communities and sort of the urban centers. Do you have anything to add on that, Charu? Just that perspective on what that looks like, that difference between the two?
Okay, I have a very small example. I came across this situation about 2 years ago. It was an event that our magazine was holding, and we had invited a young lady who now resides in the US and who's a published author, but she's a Nepali by origin. And so she came as a keynote speaker. And it was very fascinating to hear about her life story, which began in Upper Dolpo region, which is a very, very remote corner of Nepal. You need to actually walk, or you can go by helicopter. So this lady, and she's perhaps she should be in her 30s now, at the most in her early 30s. So just trying to build the context that it's not too far away also. Her childhood was spent, she, at the age of 6 or 7, she was herding yaks in a very rough terrain. She was fighting snow leopards. She was burying the dead. She was helping her mother, deliver the babies. And sometimes, because they had no access to medical facilities whatsoever, or even a health camp. So even with lack of paracetamol tablet, as basic as that, people could lose their life. She was actually burying the dead as well. And the first time that she actually saw a bus was when, for some health condition, she had to be brought to Kathmandu. So after walking 7-8 days to reach the first point where she could catch a bus, she saw this bus, and she actually thought it was some kind of a strange thing, And so that is our reality. So that's, I'm just trying to build the context that people have that as well. People are living there as well. We are living here as well, where, we are interconnected to the world. We have certain privileges. We have certain entitlements. And basically that's how our geographies kind of define where our lives take us, in terms of what we live with, what is accessible to us. And because if you look at Nepal, we have, pretty much a huge number of girls getting married, almost 40% getting married below the age of 18, below the age of 15, So it means different things, and it's different how their life is going to spiral onwards. So, yeah.
Thanks, Charu. I think it's really important to get that context and sort of remember, like Trisha said, that there are vastly different cultures depending on where you are in a country. So we're getting close to time here, and I know we haven't gotten to all the topics we wanted to, but I wanted to close with getting your perspective, so your varied perspectives, especially having Charu on the panel as a journalist. How can civil society address some of these things, some of these barriers to independence, and being able to chart your own life's course, basically, as a female in your communities and in the world? So maybe we start with Trisha, and then we'll go around to close.
So thank you. I think civil society plays a tremendous role. It's civil society as think tank as well, particularly. So ideas contributes by doing this research and identifying the barriers, and then ensuring that these messages are also relate to the target audiences themselves. We try to translate that into bite-sized information that the communities themselves would appreciate. And I think more and more, maybe just to highlight as well, in under authoritarian governments that don't necessarily listen to policy research or wanting to reform the agenda, which is exactly what we are facing now. Malaysia has been under this dominant party for the longest time. The government changed in 2018, and for a very small window of 21 months, ideas together with other civil society organizations could access government ministries and get our ideas forward, but that has changed again. And we're operating under very, very difficult and challenging conditions now. The government announced a state of emergency on the guise of handling the pandemic, but it's really a political move. And so it's increasingly difficult to actually obtain reformist views from the government when it comes to any kind of policy change. And this includes accessing, say, the women's ministry and family ministry to make those changes, or regulatory barriers reduced. So the same thing applies here, getting the message out to the communities. That's what we're trying to do more and more of. And so we're trying to build up our advocacy initiatives, having more civic tech platforms, more websites, more infographics, videos, and things like that to spread the message to communities. And then hopefully that can scale up to the important policymakers in the long run.
Wonderful. Thank you, Trisha. Charu, I'll go to you. What can civil society do to sort of break down some of these barriers?
I just want to go a little bit into what political leadership looks like currently. We are under a communist government now, and it's a very unstable government. We might be going into midterm elections again in November, amidst a lot of political turmoil, in the midst of a pandemic, where the focus should have been really the pandemic, but politics is kind of taking center stage. And when I look at leadership around the world, from even President Trump's tenure in the United States, or to see Putin, or to see, several other leaders across the globe, we look at it there's a very authoritarian style of leadership that is coming to the fore right now. I don't know whether this is something that we want, the public as a large group of people, but that's what it is literally. And civil society does play a very, very active role because, when you oppose certain things at the right time, it does have an effect. I can give you the example of what happened in Nepal after the COVID crisis started. So we were having a lot of these RDT tests taking place instead of the PCR tests. So the numbers were being rigged, the numbers were not adequate, things like that. So we had a group of young people who actually took to the streets in the midst of the first lockdown. It was called Enough is Enough. It's a movement that went onto the streets, and they demanded, that we want PCR testing for every Nepali. Now there's vaccine inequity happening everywhere. I think in the United States, you're probably not using the vaccines. Here we are like waiting for the vaccines, Civil society, definitely. And from the media perspective, definitely. That's the source. That's the source, working with think tanks, working with individuals and organizations that work towards, keeping a watch on what is happening in government is really, really crucial to how things change and move forward.
Thanks so much, Charter. I couldn't agree more. Bhuvana, we'll close with you. And I know the Trias Foundation is particularly focused specifically on women and their role in society and breaking down barriers. So tell me more about what your plans are at Trias to break down these barriers and bring economic freedom to women in India.
Thank you, Casey. At Trias, I think, both Vaishali and I, my co-founder and I, are women leaders. And so inadvertently, this has sort of become even an all-women's organization at the moment. All of our first round of 8 employees are all women. Pure accident, but a happy accident. We hope that will still continue to be sort of a recurring feature, in that we want to be able to groom young women into positions of leadership, particularly in the think tank or research and policy advisory world. And I think that will be sort of our soft contribution overall, and that's something that's important to both of us. Insofar as how do you change the life for median women in India? This is something that we, have deep interest in, anger about as well. And there are 4 things that we're largely focusing on. One is the question number 1, right? What are all the ways, let's identify all the ways in which women become sort of net liabilities on a household's balance sheet instead of net assets as they rightly should be, right? And inevitably, a large part of this stems from the institutional framework, by which I really mean sort of the legal and regulatory framework. So that's one for us. The second is looking at these issues from the point of view of sort of 3 groups or 3 roles that women tend to play. So women as job seekers and employees, right? The second is women as entrepreneurs potentially. And the third is women as consumers. So sort of unpacking the ways in which this affects women playing these sort of 3 roles, if you will. The third is looking more broadly at, rather than finding alliances, building alliances, right? We're not going to get very far by being sort of operating in silos. So at least from our point of view, our sort of our worldview on this is, let's find people on which we agree on issues. We may not agree ideologically or principally on, sort of everything, but on this particular issue, on this narrow question, we're all aligned and we're going to go after it. And the last of it is sort of also finding windows of opportunity. So, for example, the world is sort of talking a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals, right? And there are several. I mean, it's a long list of wish list of ways to improve people's lives. But one particular item that I think gets underappreciated or does not get as much attention is 5.1.1, which is ending legal discrimination against women. So that's one sort of opportunity that we are keeping our eyes trained on, both because it becomes a neat policy conversation entry point, but also because it is part of a sort of more global viewpoint, if you will. I know the sun is casting a weird shadow on my face, and maybe that's a sign for me to wrap up.
Thank you, Bhuvana. Well, what an amazing panel. Thank you so much for being here with me today. This has just been eye-opening, and I hope our audience enjoyed it as much as I did. I sometimes think about all of the women that came before us that made it possible for the four of us to be here with you today and to be women that set our own life's course. And it's really amazing, and I'm just so grateful for women that came before and the women who are here with us today for what they do to advocate for equal rights. It can seem a miracle when you think of all the legal barriers that we've talked about today, all the cultural barriers that we're here today with you, but we are because of the people who came before us. So thank you so much to our panel, and we'll close out there. So this is the end of our Asia Liberty Forum. We want to thank everyone for joining us for this conference this year. And thank you so much to our co-hosts, Bakalpa and Alternative, based in Nepal. Next year, we hope to be in person in Manila in the Philippines with the Foundation for Economic Freedom, and we'll have more information soon about when that might be able to happen. I do hope that you can join us in Miami for our annual Liberty Forum and Freedom Dinner, which will take place in person and online Monday through Tuesday, December 13th to 14th. And finally, as we learn and adapt to the new hybrid world that we're all living in, we want to learn as much as we can about your virtual experience. Soon you'll receive an event survey in your email, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can continue to improve these programs in the future. Thanks again, and we'll see you again next time.